Hello and welcome to AXSchat. I'm delighted today to welcome Anita Aaron from World Institute on Disability. Fantastic to have you with us. I need to declare a, how do we put it? That I'm part of this because I recently joined the board of directors of World Institute on Disability. But Anita's been doing all of the hard work. So Anita's in charge, and so both Deborah and I, whilst we are members of the board, really defer to Anita because Anita's the one that does all of the amazing stuff. So Anita, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and of course what WID is doing and the aims behind the Institute?
Yes, I would be happy to do that. And thank you. You know, it's a misnomer that the director directs anything. I really run around facilitating the board of directors to do as much for the organization as I can get them to do. So I see almost as if I see it backwards. WID was started in 1983. By three disability rights leaders, Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, and Joan, who, although already fairly well known in the international arena, left state employment to create WID. They'd been working for the California Department of Rehabilitation, and when the administration changed, they left and began to plan what their next step was. And they decided that there needed to be an international forum, a place where people with disabilities from around the globe could compare how things worked in their area, in their country, in their city, and that we could then all work together on sort of a cross-cultural disability rights agenda. Both Ed and Judy were polio survivors. So they were interested in really eradicating polio on one hand and carrying the mission that could be done, but also in accommodating people that were post-polio individuals and help them create a more accessible life for themselves. And it grew from that point of reference. So World Institute on Disability looks at, on an ongoing basis, what are the critical issues facing people with disabilities, and what do we believe are significant inroads we could make towards addressing those issues. So in the early days, it was about educating. It was about Ed and Judy going around the world and speaking to this disability group and that disability group and working with governments to see what kinds of inroads they could make. That was also before the Americans with Disabilities Act, the US major legislation for people with disabilities. And so a lot of Ed and Judy's work was focused on getting the ADA passed. If you fast forward 35 years, where we are today, WID's main mission right now is our signature program is what we call WID E3, which stands for Employment and Economic Empowerment. And what we're doing is putting together a set of tools that are available online, but that also we can work with organizations to have them build in our tools into what they're already doing around employment, around disability benefits, and around economic inclusion. So I'm going to take a breath there because that's a fast trip. And if you'd like me to, focus on any one thing.
Yeah, I think Antonio's got a question for you.
No, I'm a member of the Rotary Club, and I'm Rotarian, so I'm curious to see if you had any engagements with that in relation to what we're talking in relation to polio.
Say that again, with what?
With the Rotary Club. With the Rotarians.
Are you familiar with the Rotary Club?
Yes. I was trying to insert world in there somewhere. Yes, and in fact, just to infuse a little bit of me in here, I was one of the first hires that Judy and Ed and Joan made in 1983 when they got their first funding from to do work. Then I left for 20 years and was the CEO of the LightHouse for the Blind, which is headquartered in San Francisco. It's a regional organization. And through the LightHouse, we worked basically hand in glove with the Rotary clubs. So we would meet, we would go to their monthly meetings. They were very good at raising money to sponsor young people with visual impairments to go to the camp that the LightHouse still hosts and runs. And so I have a great appreciation for the Rotary Club. We don't work with the Rotary Club directly through WID because we're not a direct services organization. So it's less easy to kind of find points of engagement.
Yeah, okay. So so I think one of the things that that interested me about WID was its focus on strategy and its focus on empowering other strategic organizations to include accessibility and inclusion practices into their strategy. So I know that you also over time did a lot of work that was sponsored by the US State Department on helping increase knowledge outside of the US. Hence, it's not like some other US World Series. World does actually mean global in the sense of WID. It's not like baseball. So can you tell us a little bit about that kind of work and what you've done over the years in terms of working in other parts of the globe?
Yeah, it's funny when the founders, when Ed and Judy were looking for a name for the organization, and World Institute on Disability is a brazen name, if you will. That says a lot about what their vision was. They really wanted something that wasn't, that really could inform the work we do and it could be applied globally. And so from the start, our goal has been to not go out and tell other people how they should run disability rights in their country, but to facilitate the capacity for them to do that themselves. Along the way, we learned that a lot of organizations, particularly organizations in the EU, are at least at the same level of policy development as the US, and some have in a way moved past us. And that's really, that's just very exciting. And because you have partners around the globe. So what we look at is ways to partner with organizations around the globe to build capacity. One of the most recent international projects that we did was actually funded through USAID, Agency on International Development, in the Republic of Georgia. And it was to establish a wheelchair manufacturing and distribution network in Georgia and surrounding countries. And we did that. We worked with local organizations to set up the factory and the assembly. We figured out where to ship the parts in. We put all that together. That organization is predominantly staffed by people with disabilities, most of them wheelchair users themselves. So it's an employment process as well. But it's also an organization that serves as an advocacy point. If you get wheelchairs into the hands of users that prior to were unable to even leave their homes, you have more critical mass pushing for curb cuts, for accessible buildings, for government programs. So we believe that we look at things on 2 or 3 different levels when we're doing international projects. The base one, and then what does that generate? And one of the things in Georgia that it generated was that many people, particularly in the cities in Georgia, live in high-rise concrete buildings with no elevators. And you don't necessarily, you take what's available in housing. There's no accessible housing to speak of. So in trying to get a policy in place where if you were on the 10th floor and you needed a wheelchair, we could get you that wheelchair, but then your housing was an issue. You still couldn't use it. So one policy then addresses another policy and opens up the thinking of the government about how to really be dealing with what does accessibility really mean. And that's kind of been the nature of our international policy and capacity building work.
I think that's really interesting because a lot of the time where we meet resistance to doing accessibility stuff is people say, well, it's not that I don't want to do it, it's I don't know where to start. But what you're actually saying is if you start somewhere, it's going to lead on to more stuff happening. And that's what I see also. So I see that when we take an action in one place, that improves things in that one place, but it also creates these other new tensions. And tension in a good way. It's positive tension because it's someone's been given access and they can do new things, but then it creates that next level of issues that people become aware of. And so what we end up is you take these small steps forwards, but each small step adds to building up to bigger steps, and therefore I think we really need to be encouraging people to take those first steps, because it's the first steps that are the most important of all, because without those first steps we'll not get anywhere. So and not to be afraid to take those first steps either.
Yeah, if you don't start, you don't finish. One of the examples that came to my mind as you were talking was while we were in Georgia, one of the projects we took on in Tbilisi was the local church, and it was a wonderful historical landmark with steps at every entrance, many, many, many steps. And when the local organization, what we would do is work with the local leaders of the disability movement in Georgia and kind of support them in meeting with these government or institutional bodies. So there was a meeting with the church leaders, and we said, we'd really like to talk with you about building a ramp into the facility. And first they said, there are no people with disabilities in our congregation. And we pointed out, how would they know that? Because they couldn't get in. And when I say that, those are all gentle conversations, as you were saying. It wasn't like we walked in and said, we're going to picket your church if you don't build a ramp. It was nothing like that. It was diplomacy. And then secondly, after we pointed out that people couldn't get in, they talked about it being a historic landmark and how would they do this. After a number of months, an agreement was reached, and the agreement was that the church leaders asked if the disability community would help build the ramp. So it was obvious to the church goers and to the community that this was being built for a reason. There were people who wanted to use this ramp. It wasn't just kind of a ramp for no one to nowhere. And it turned out to be a really empowering model for both the members of that congregation, but also for people with disabilities who had never even considered that they could get into the church on their own. And I don't know, that story, I just always found that example to be very powerful to me personally.
Well, considering also the history, a country like Georgia that was part of the ex-Soviet Union, with a long tradition on industry and engineering. So when you were engaging with them at the public level, what type of questions were you getting more often? Were about especially from government officials. What was the thing that was there that would generate more questions, for say so?
You know, I think it, by the way, I have hearing loss. Maybe I should do a little disclaimer here. I have vision loss. I have hearing loss. I even have arthritis in my knees. So sometimes when I pause, it's because I'm going backwards in my mind to make sure I heard you correctly. But I think it's the overwhelm. They don't know where to start. And there's all these policies and regulations in place, and that's anywhere. So first of all, they think, they being whoever the entity is that's that you have to go through, is throwing at first all the things, the reasons why they think they can't do anything. And then you have to kind of deal with each of those one question at a time and help, not only help them see, but many times we have to educate ourselves to even understand what that jurisdiction's regulations are. And the same thing happens if you fast forward into the technology world, where it's very difficult for me to understand why isn't technology just accessible to me as a blind person, and it ought to be, right? But I think the steps that it takes to bring along tech companies, telecom companies who are in this race to release the next best product and to get more market share out there, to then have to slow that system down to create access is really difficult. And I think it's the same as the first stairs that got turned into a ramp. It's that same kind of architectural barrier that everybody sees first before they see the solution around it.
Help if I unmuted, wouldn't it? Okay, so so I think that's interesting, and obviously I'm working in the IT field. So a couple of points, I think. So firstly is when we work with organizations like the Business Disability Forum, again, sort of advisory group, or also it's actually, it is a proper forum, so people come together and they share what they've learned. We also share where we failed, and where we're having problems, and actually that's really useful, because then other people can see, well, actually no one's perfect. So we do a number of things. So looking at anonymous benchmarking, and working with maturity models, and what you can see is that there are frameworks for improvement, but also that you can take those steps, and that there is a way to get from A to B to C. And then finally, the piece about the software companies and everything else, actually the really hard thing for them to do is not to develop the new product accessibly, is to make their existing ones accessible, because that costs them a fortune, because they haven't designed it in. So what I'm encouraging companies to do, and others too, so other large businesses through forums like the BDF, is to not think about too hard about their existing product set, because it's legacy and they're going to get rid of it, but actually concentrate their efforts on designing in accessibility into their newer products, because that's the path of least resistance. That's the way that you change the world over time, rather than banging your head against a brick wall to try and change the older products. We know how painful and expensive that can be. So just to give an example from the real world, rough average cost of doing accessibility on a product is 2 to 3% of the project cost. Retrofitting it, I know of at least one project where it cost 110% of the project cost. So really don't want to, retrofitting and looking at legacy is hugely expensive. So let's plan for it. It's 2 to 3% usually within the margin of error of product and project budgets anyway, and it's certainly usually within the margin of contingency planning. So it's doable for companies if we sell it in that way. So I think that's a message that we want to get out to people. And also, you were right, you talked about something that I think really appealed to me, and one of the reasons why I'm so behind the aims of WIT is the idea of accessibility as diplomacy, because we've seen the other side of it, where and yes, people have rights, and yes, it's infuriating when you can't do stuff that you should be able to do and you're legally entitled to do, but sometimes the picketing doesn't help, right? It's finding that way to resolve that tension and that conflict in a way that satisfies both parties, and I think the word diplomacy was spot on for me.
The other thing that's interesting, a number of years ago, probably 12 or so at this point, while I was at the LightHouse for the Blind, we worked with the city of San Francisco to come up with an agreement through structured negotiations, not a lawsuit, to install accessible pedestrian signals at traffic where there were already traffic lights. And the same issue was brought up, that it was so much more expensive to retrofit the existing lights that they negotiated with us to be able to do a few kind of critical intersections that already had traffic lights, but to build accessible pedestrian signals into all new installations and upgrades. So in doing that, now that we're out a few years, we have many more intersections in San Francisco that have audible signals than we would have had with the same budget availability if we had focused on the ones that were already built. And it's frustrating to those of us who could use, we would like them to be everywhere. Over time they will be, because they're going to have to change out all that equipment. It's hard to wait, and yet you get more in the end. And I think that's the lesson I keep learning, although it's taken me a lot of my life to learn it.
Yeah. No, but that's another great example. And I like collecting these examples because they're really nuggets, and it's not software, so that's also really good. Antonio, did you have another question?
Yes, no, Anita, if you go back to your career and see, and try to find a way to compare how fast things were moving when you were starting and how fast things move today, are you able to establish a comparison?
Can you repeat that, Neil? Or are you on mute?
Sure. I'll just take myself off mute again. It's warm today, so I've got the window open and there's traffic going past. So, Antonio was talking about the speed of change. And have you noticed that there's an acceleration when you look back at the beginning of your career and now where you are now? Are things changing and moving faster, particularly with a view on accessibility?
I guess the answer is yes and no. I still think when you go into a community or to a sector where it's a new topic, it's slow and steady. If you're going into a place where you're trying to get them to adopt accessibility platforms as they move forward with a new release, particularly if it's technology, it's much quicker now because the releases are much quicker, and there's a system in place for working with developers that wasn't there before. So I think technology and technology access is really moving more quickly than it ever did before. In terms of issues like employment, and are more people with disabilities employed today than 30 or 40 years ago? At least in the US, the answer is no. The needle has not moved much at all. And so you would think with all that fast-moving technology, with accessibility issues built in, that why isn't employment moving along at a faster clip as well? And we have some theories at WID, because that's what we do. We sort of sit around at the table and think out loud and debate and discuss, and then come up with how can we approach an issue and have some sort of impact. And one of the things we believe is that we have to do a better job in equipping individuals with disabilities, one, to think that they're going to get a job, that they have the opportunity to work, they have the right to work, and then to help get them into sort of the flow of how people find work. What's that process? Because if you've not been a job seeker, you don't know how to find a job. And then on the other side, to work with companies to be more engaging and more open by the way they brand, by the way they, but right down to what does their website say? Do they, and if there's photos on the website, does it incorporate employees with disabilities in those photos? Can you click to a page on diversity and inclusion that isn't buried? And when you get to that page, does it talk about disability? Or is that left to some other subcategory? So I think our interest is, how do we employ the kinds of efforts on top of what people are already trying to do to get other areas of critical need to move as fast as technology access seems to be moving right now.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing of imagery is really important. You want to. There's a couple of things. The whole pipeline thing. Depending on which bits of world you're in terms of employment, yes, you can have technology, but if people don't get access to technology in the early stages of education, they lag behind in education, and they lack the skills to be able to do the jobs that we as employers want them to do. So we've got a job of work to do as a community to make sure that we can get people educated, and get them to have the employability skill and the employable skills that we as employers need from them. And in the UK, we've done a really great job of getting people through tertiary education. So if you're privileged enough to have the support of your family and the education department to get you to the point where you can reach tertiary education, there's fantastic support. But that means that it's only the people that are in the more privileged positions that eventually end up getting that support. So, we've done a good job, but we've still got more to do. And then also there's the whole piece about the image, both in the media and how companies portray disability in the public face of their organization. And I think that some small number of companies are now doing a standout job on this. I think that organizations like Microsoft, like SAP, are actually actively marketing disability employment programs and actively including people in their general marketing, which is even more important, because actually we want to have people with disabilities a part of normal society, and we want that reflected in the literature that companies produce, that the media produces, and everything else. And then I guess there's the whole piece around sort of the employment and the access to the job application processes and everything else, and they're pretty broken too, if I'm honest. Yeah.
I completely agree. And in fact, there's some indicators, or there's some changes in the way our economy, at least in the US, is working, that has generated more outreach by companies to try to engage people with disabilities. one of those elements is in our government, both local, state, and federal, and that is that a lot of employees who went into government employment are now reaching retirement age, and those entities are looking everywhere for that new crop of employees that they can bring in. So now they're very interested in looking at areas that heretofore they didn't spend a lot of time on. So trying to find out where's a good way, how's the best way to recruit people with disabilities? How do I do that? What do I need to do around accommodation? Those are now questions being asked that we used to, in the disability biz, be trying to force those answers on them before they ever were at the table to ask the question. The other thing is with the tech companies, where they can't fill their engineering jobs. They can't find all the people that they need. And so some of the programs they're looking at with those of us who work around disability is how can we help encourage people to get involved in STEM, even in grade school, and to think about STEM, engineering, mathematics, technology, and science as a career choice. So I think if you can find the right, you find the industry that has the need, and you can then work with people with disabilities to be part of the answer to that need, employment will increase for people with disabilities.
And Anita, we are very close to the end of our interview, but I would really like to ask you, if you look to the new technology that is coming, so many things like virtual reality, Internet of Things. There are so many technologies that people are talking today. Is there any particular technology that you see as hopeful, as a way to improve the life of people with disabilities?
Well, I'm really interested in AI, in artificial intelligence, to see how that will be some of the interface. And part of that's got to do with my own disability. My cell phone, my smartphone, is a critical tool for me. It's got speech output. I've got apps on there where I can read documents. If I have your face in my contacts list, I've got an app that will find you in a room if I ask it to. There are things like that. So I've got a lot of interest in AI. I also think that putting together sets of tools that are accessible to people is a really important thing. So as computers get smaller and smaller and smaller and reduced down to your phone, what else do you need to run your life, and how do people with various disabilities manage that? So I think taking the platforms everyone is using and then looking at how those can be connected for people with varying disabilities is sort of where we believe AI may be able to fill a real gap.
Fantastic. I'm also very excited about AI. Obviously, there's issues that we need to cover off around sort of unconscious bias and so on and other areas, but from a disability inclusion point of view, it holds enormous potential for good, and it's something very exciting. So we've reached the end of our half hour. I need to thank our supporters, Barclays, for helping us with keeping the lights on and making sure that we do captions in a timely manner. It's always good to have that kind of support. It's always good to have friends. So thank you very much, Anita. It's been a real pleasure interviewing you. It's a pleasure working with you. We look forward to you joining us on Twitter on Tuesday night.
Thank you.
Thank you.